Welcome to my Self-Care Shit, the podcast, where we talk about what true self-care looks and feels like. I'm your host, Kathy Love, two-time TEDx speaker, author, and self-care coach. Each week, we'll have honest conversations on how to create the peace and stability we crave in our lives. Brian Sacheta is an author, blogger, and mental health advocate from Boston, Massachusetts. After years of battling his own anxiety and depression, he immersed himself in therapy, psychology literature, and countless self-experiments, determined to find effective ways forward. Eventually, his hard-won breakthroughs inspired him to share what he learned and support others navigating similar struggles. Today, Brian runs Get Out of Your Head, a mental health-focused brand and book series that helps people take control of their well-being through practical, real-world tactics. All right, Brian, I am so excited to have you here today to talk about some real self-care shit. And I just love the angle that you look at it from and the things that you talk about. So I wanted to introduce you to everyone. And I'm actually going to let you do that. I'm going to let you tell us a little bit about yourself. And what I'm most curious about is how you got into talking about the self-care shit from your background, which is not necessarily an obvious line.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Kathy. I am Brian Sacheta, owner and author of Get Out of Your Head, which is both a brand and a book series that seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression. I am not a clinician, I'm not a doctor. I come to this space through personal experience. So I would say for most of my life, at least, my adolescence and thereon, have dealt with anxiety, depression, OCD, that kind of stuff. And, I think what really got me into it was coming to it from a place where I found myself at the age of 16, 17, 18, dealing with all these emotions and not having the tools to really handle them, right? And I don't blame anybody, but I look around and I think to myself, my parents are awesome people, but they're accountants, and wealth managers. They're not psychoanalysts or doctors or anything like that. So nobody in my family really had an understanding of this stuff. And yet here I am at young ages dealing with it and not knowing how to move forward. And so essentially what happened was I started having panic attacks in my teens. I really didn't know what they were. They were really harrowing. I didn't know how to handle them. And because I didn't feel as though I had a lot of lifelines and whatnot, unfortunately, I just held a lot of this in until it started pouring out, right? And then that's where you start having panic attacks, is essentially your nervous system is like, this is way too much for us to handle and way too much for us to process. So this energy needs to come out in some capacity. And so essentially, over the next 10 years or so, I basically would luckily nothing too horrible happened to me in life, but I did the normal things that scare you as a teenager or a young adult, right? Going to job interviews, going on dates with people that you're interested in, giving public speeches and whatnot, and just having that gnawing anxiety rip away at me day after day after day. And eventually saying to myself, this is no way to live. I can't keep doing this to myself. Otherwise, I'm going to be in a really bad place really soon. And so that became something of my call to action, to say to myself, I need to do something about this. I need to learn about this condition. I need to talk to people. I need to figure it out. And what I would also say is this was, all of this is kind of happening around the age of 18 and around the year of 2008, where the world's a very different place. The internet is not really the place that it is today. There's not nearly as much information on the internet at that time as there is today. There was no social media. Conversations around mental health were not expansive whatsoever. So I'm really, given the fact that I don't have a lot of outlets and I don't have a lot of information at my disposal on the internet, I'm kind of white knuckling it and trying to figure it out for myself. And so I don't recommend that to folks, but I would say, in the end, I had my journey, right, of 10 years of figuring out my own anxiety and whatnot. And it's still a journey, like life just really is. You keep going on the path. But over the course of those first 10 years, those were really formative for me, where I started to figure out what this anxiety thing was, what made me anxious, what were my triggers, what allowed me to regulate myself, so on and so forth. And so at the end of those 10 years, I had a lot of information at my disposal where I said to myself, hey, I'd like to do something with this information. I've been through what I consider to be a lot of pain and a lot of distress. Can I take that information, bundle it, into a book or something similar, share it with other people and allow them to alleviate some of their suffering or kind of accelerate the timeline on which they are dealing with this stuff.
I love that. I said the same thing when I went through what I went through, that there had to be a reason for it. I had to be able to use it somehow to help other people, to maybe shorten the cycle. You can't take everybody's journey away from them, but sometimes you can just shine a light on certain things and just help them along. And and so I love that you've used your experience to help other people. And I know that since 2008, and with all of the additional information and access to information out there, the issues are just as prevalent, if not even more so. Especially, I love talking to men about this topic because it's so under talked about for young men and men of all ages, to be honest. Um, I have one question though about what you were saying in feeling like you didn't have a lot of outlets. Did you have people around you? Did you play sports? Did you have friends? Was there no one there to talk to, or were there people who you didn't feel comfortable talking to?
A little bit of both, I would say. So I had a good friend group, but again, this is 2008. We were all, macho men kind of thing, right? Of, oh, we don't feel feelings, we don't have emotions. If you experience anxiety, you're a wimp, that kind of thing. And it wasn't like us looking at each other and really saying like I look down upon you. It was the culture in which we were living, right? It was sort of the water that we swam in, where men were not supposed to feel certain ways and women could feel certain ways. And so it just kind of felt like, in high school, middle school, whatever, like that's just the product of the environment you live in. And especially, 20 years ago, that was very much so the case. Whereas I look at Gen Z and, I give them credit. They are much different than my generation, where they're willing to talk about this stuff. In fact, a lot of them talk about it all the time. And I just think about how different that would be if I had, that kind of experience, support, whatever. I think also too, right, was like, when you're young, you're trying to find your footing, and it's a combination of the environment that you're in, but then also who you are as a person. So kind of nature versus nurture. I think in some ways I tend to be a little bit more introverted, or I keep to myself at times. It's not that I'm fully introverted. I like hanging out with people and whatnot, but at that young age where you're uncertain of yourself and you have your self doubts, if you don't look around and see role models that are providing you safe spaces to talk about these things, it's probably going to reinforce the innate natures that you have of, oh, okay, I'm a little bit more introverted. I'm going to stay that way because nobody is necessarily showing me that it's okay to be the opposite. So it was sort of, what's the right term? It was just a combination of things, a confluence of things that sort of built upon themselves and made the situation worse. And so I look at my writing and I say, looking back, it actually makes perfect sense that I went to that route in order to express myself, because I have all this energy inside of myself. I don't feel as though, whether this was an accurate assessment or not, I didn't feel as though I had those outlets that I could lean on. So I'm like, the only outlet I know is I know how to write words on pages, and so I'm just going to speak my feelings into the computer and see what happens.
And that was your training. So you didn't go to school to be a licensed therapist, but you instead studied computer programming.
Yeah, so I did study computer programming at college, and then that's been my full-time career since. It's funny because you sort of alluded to this earlier, and people will ask me, how do you get into the mental health space when you're a software developer?
Right.
And I don't really think that there's a great overlap or parallel. I kind of look at it more as, I've been fighting these internal battles my whole life, and they need a voice. And so at some point that's going to come out. And then also, like, whatever you do 40 hours a week or longer, depending on, what your work life is like, you're going to start seeing parallels between the most important areas of your life, whether or not they're like the most obvious or true things in the world, right? So I would start writing software and I'd think to myself, oh, My mind kind of works like this a little bit, where it's looping over things and it has a hard time breaking out of certain, conditions or statements that it's trying to evaluate and whatnot. And so as I was learning different concepts in the computer programming field, in my mind, I'm always thinking to myself, like, oh, this concept here, right? So, like, I'm just going to use a term. It's like memory pointers in software development. Oh, that's really interesting. They point to a specific part of the computer and say, go get me what is at that address. The mind works like that a little bit as well, where, so essentially the software is trying to say, go get me what is at that address in the memory, not really explaining to you that what is in that spot could change. And so your brain does that a lot as well, where you say to yourself, okay, like I'm going on a date with somebody, and that's all that's happening is I'm going on a date with so and so person. And so your brain points at that spot in your memory and says, what are dates like? And then even though you're going on a date with a specific person and it technically doesn't have anything to do with your past, all of a sudden your memory, your brain starts pointing to all the past failures, all the past difficulties, and all of a sudden you are thinking about things that, yes, they are very related. They may be caught up in the emotional experience you're going through right now, but they technically are not the date that you're about to go on, right? And so I'm seeing these different concepts as I'm learning them in the software development world and just saying to myself, it honestly happened subconsciously was I'm dealing, I have these two lives. I have the software life, I have the mental health life. Because both of them are so prevalent, they're going to feed upon one another. And so when I learn one of these concepts, the mental health side of my brain is going to be like, bam, that reminds me of XYZ. And then, I kind of just took some of those concepts and started writing about them, which is a little funny because like some of my writing is technical, but it's not meant to be like anxiety for software developers. It's really sort of like anxiety and depression and mental health for folks who think a lot. And let's be honest, a lot of us think a lot. We have jobs where we're trained to do that, we're incentivized to do that, whether it's, putting together a tax return or a financial model or whatever. We sit at our desks 40 hours a week and we think a lot. And so being able to draw those parallels back to people who use those critical thinking skills and say, hey, here are some of the lifelines for getting out of your own mind, I think that can be helpful for people.
I love that. I love that. The analysis, the over-analysis, the loops that you mentioned that we get stuck in, those self-talk loops are so important. Those are some of the true self-care strategies and things that we talk about. So how does someone recognize when they're in a loop and what can they do about it? Is that loop predetermined and it'll just continue, and it's just noticing it, or can you actually interfere with the loop?
Yeah, I'm going to give an answer that lies somewhere in the middle. And that's kind of my brand is like a no BS kind of thing, right? I'm not here to say, hey, everything's awesome and you can get yourself out of the loop immediately and anxiety's no big deal, right? Like you look at the image over my shoulder of this snarling snake, right? There's a reason that my brand looks like that is I'm trying to put out the image of saying that this stuff is really hard. A lot of people struggle with it. I struggle with it. I have struggled with it in the past. There's no reason to necessarily shy away from that. We just have to deal with it. That's our reality and we have to deal with it. When it comes to getting out of a loop, I would say the same thing kind of applies, which is one, the loops tend to happen, for the most part on a subconscious level. And that's what makes them so difficult is we don't realize consciously all the time that we are looping. And yet like 10 minutes will go by where we're doing that looping. And then all of a sudden we think to ourselves, wow, I feel terrible right now. Right. So the real crux of the looping or what we have to work on, the skill that we have to practice is the skill of awareness. And I'm not trying to make that sound new agey, hippy dippy, whatever. It's really getting to the point of saying these loops start subconsciously, as in your brain is scanning the environment for things that are threatening to you. On a subconscious level, you're not always doing this consciously. And when it detects something that is threatening, it's going to start signaling throughout the brain, throughout the body that something is amiss and that something is threatening, right? So it's going to essentially turn the alarms on within your body. And there's a bunch of different ways that the alarms could sound, one of them being this looping, right? And so something that I like to talk about a lot on this front is the wiring of the nervous system, the evolution of the body, and also what is known as evolutionary mismatch. So you think about, let's just, easy numbers. Let's say 1 million years ago on the plains of Africa, our ancestors, right? They had pretty much the same hardware that we do, as in they had nervous systems and brains and, amygdalas and all that, right? They have neurotransmitters and stress hormones and stuff like that. So when they are out on the plains of Africa and they see a tiger, the stress response in their body is going to go off, right? Essentially, the amygdala is going to say, I sense something that is threatening. Therefore, cue all the alarms to start going and blaring out, right? And so back then, that was very helpful, because if you were in front of a life or death threat in that moment, you had to get the heck out of there, right? And so people will often refer to this system, or, the thing that I'm alluding to, as the fight or flight response, the acute stress response. That system is designed to get us out of those immediate and acute stressors. And so that was all well and good 1 million years ago when we were running from, hungry tigers. The real challenge, and where this term evolutionary mismatch comes back in, is it's now 1 million years later. The environment in which we live is vastly different from that of our forebears. And the challenge with that is we're still dealing with the same hardware that is designed to get us running or fighting with or from tigers, right? And yet the stressors that we face today are much different. When you have a performance review on your calendar a week from now, that's a threatening thing. That's something that scares you. And yet you can't fight with that performance review. You can't run from it. Like, sure, you could quit your job and say, I'm not going to go to it. But I think we'd all know that, forgoing your paycheck or whatever is also kind of threatening, right? So the real challenge is coming to terms with the fact that our environments are much different than they were a long time ago. And our brains, unfortunately, are not designed or set up to deal with the kind of stressors that we face these days. Why am I saying all of this? All of this is to say that we have to find a way to align with that hardware that we've been given. So when we are sitting on our couches and we're saying to ourselves, oh my goodness, I found that awareness that I am looping right now. Why am I doing that? What's going on? Once you have an understanding of what's happening there, you can bring in the reassurance piece and say, oh, I understand. My brain is thinking that performance review is the equivalent of a hungry tiger. It's not, but it's causing the same reaction in my body. Now, kind of to close this out, right, to think about how do we regulate ourselves? How do we break ourselves out of the loop? We have to remember that we are still dealing with that same hardware from 1 million years ago. Therefore, the same tactics that our ancestors used to get away from tigers is probably going to benefit us in the situation where we are, quote unquote, harmlessly sitting on the couch and looping over a performance review, right? So what does that look like? Go back to the term fight or flight. That means not, again, we can't fight with a performance review, but what we can do is we can tap back into our bodies. We can get up off the couch. We can go for a walk. And as we go for a walk, we're basically sending a signal back to our bodies saying, I got this. This is okay. The adrenaline and the cortisol that you are coursing through my veins right now, I am using that as motivation to get up and go for this walk. And once I do that, I'm hoping that, we can burn off some of those hormones and then sort of pacify you a little bit, right? So the real challenge is the fact that, when you're dealing with things in the mind, your mind wants to go to that place of logic, but that's not how the body and the brain are designed. And so we need to tap back into those same methods for which we were designed, right? Doing deep breathing, going for a walk, moving your eyes around, getting yourself to a place where you're not just sitting on the couch and rehashing things endlessly. The last piece that I will say here is a lot of people, if you look into the science around the nervous system and anxiety and all that, is when you have that trigger, right? When the amygdala detects threat and all of a sudden you're scared, the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain, which is designed to help you regulate your emotions, think critically, plan, and all of that, that actually goes offline a little bit. And it makes sense why it does, right? If you're in front of a hungry tiger, you don't have time to sit there and be like, hey, I wonder what the tiger's favorite movie is and what his friends are like and what food he likes to eat. You got to get the heck out of there. The problem with that prefrontal cortex deactivation is the fact that when your critical thinking skills go offline, it becomes really hard to think through the problem, right? So the very first thing you have to do when you're in the middle of the loop, even though you're going to want to go immediately into the critical thinking, it's not going to work. You need to get up, you need to move your body, you need to essentially do what your body is asking you to do, as in fight or flight. And then once you do that, your prefrontal cortex is going to come back online a little bit. And that is sort of the invitation or the putting the foot in the door to say, I'm feeling a little bit better now. Other parts of my brain are coming back online. And now that I feel this way, oh, look at that. I remember that I have a few other tactics at my disposal, some of the ones that are more aligned with critical thinking, if you will. And I can use those to further get myself out of this loop.
That was fantastic. I love the way you took us through the steps and the visuals and I love that. That was such a great explanation of that, of what happens. And part of what happens is that we're just being human. And so many people will say to me, I just can't stop, or I don't know what's wrong with me, right? Like, why am I constantly? But that's why. It's because of what you explained about the way our brains are wired. And so it's just that noticing. And then the way you were in your storytelling of that, there were parts where it sounded like you were talking back to your brain, right? Like you were using that self-talk, like, okay, I see you. You think there's a threat. You're sending the cortisol, you're sending the stress response to me, but I know I'm safe. And so I'm going to do something about it to show you, right?
Yeah. And you
You're
have
kind
to
of
do
being
that.
an involved person in the conversation.
Absolutely. I think you have to do it because if you don't, then your nervous system, your anxiety, they become your enemies, right? And it's essentially you pitted against them. And again, I'm not trying to sound kumbaya or whatever, but once you start talking to it again and say to yourself, like, yeah, I get it. It's very scary. I don't want to go through this right now, but we're all on the same side here. We're all trying to survive. That's when you can start to live in a bit more harmony and try to work together.
Yeah, I love that. I just love the example that you used about the job performance review, because that is such a great real life example of a threat. And sometimes when people they understand that there's not that tiger anymore, but they don't necessarily understand that these experiences that we have in our life are threats. They're threats sometimes to our financial ability to take care of our families. They're threats to our reputation. They're threats to our relationships. And so I love the way you weaved into that storytelling a real life threat. So thank you for that. All right, Brian, can you give us a little bit about the framework that you have built in volume one of your two books? Can you just give us a little bit of how that works?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it'll dovetail nicely with what we talked about a minute ago with the nervous system and the looping and all that. So, a little preamble, which is so I've got my first book, which is called Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. As I mentioned earlier or alluded to earlier, that book was the product of 10 years of really white knuckling it, sort of boots on the ground, trying to figure out my own anxiety, figure out what worked for me, what didn't. I read a lot of different information. I went to therapy. I was really trying to take in as much information as I could, distill it down, and then say, hey, readers, these are the things that I have vetted that I think work for me. Maybe they work for you too. So in the first half of that book, I present this framework, which is called the 10 steps to getting out of your head. The idea is I'm trying to give readers a bunch of easily digestible tactics that they can take on and use when they're already feeling anxious. So,
Perfect.
that fear dials up, and then the person says to themselves, how do I get out of this state? How do I regulate myself? That is the goal and the purpose of the 10 steps to getting out of your head. Funny enough, we sort of covered a couple of them already. And I will say just a little bit of a disclaimer or whatever the right word is. I am working on an updated edition of that first book. It's been in the works for a while, just been very busy and stressed with work and all that, but trying to get it out in 2026. So in the updated edition, the first step is actually to move your body or at least your eyes. And we, again, we talked about those sorts of things or alluded to them in the long discussion about the nervous system. The second one is to do some deep breathing. And, just to recap those, when you're tapping back into your physiology, you're sending those messages back to your nervous system to say, I get it. It's scary. I don't know what to do about this right now, but it's okay. We're going to figure it out. That kind of thing, right? We don't necessarily need to keep sounding the alarms. This is part of the human experience. This is part of going through stressors and scary things. So we talked about those. Why don't we jump on to which will be the next one? So this will be step 4, I believe. In the current version of the book, it is step 3. And it states, evaluate the potential outcomes and reconnect to the one you want. And so
can you just read that? Can you just read that or say that again for us?
Yes, absolutely. So this is evaluate the potential outcomes and reconnect to the one you want. And so it's a little out of context at the moment, but we'll put it in context. So, when we're feeling anxious, obviously what's happening is like we are stewing over something usually specific. We're looping over some threat, something that scares us, right? So going back to the example of the performance review, we could say to ourselves, okay, if the step is evaluate the potential outcomes and reconnect to the one you want, what that step is telling us is there are many potential outcomes from the performance review. There's actually probably a good one, and my anxiety right now is hiding that one from me or distracting me from it, right? We have in our brains this thing called the innate negativity bias. And that it actually makes sense when you think about it, right? So the innate negativity bias is sort of the phenomenon in the brain where we focus on the negative possible outcomes, the negative externalities before we focus on the things that could make us happy, uplift us, that sort of thing. That also comes from our, prehistoric or evolutionary wiring, which is, you think about being again on the plains of Africa. If you're in front of a tiger, or if you're just out in the forest and you hear a rustle, in the bushes or in the trees, if you're not looking out, if your brain is not scanning and saying, hey, that could be a chipmunk, but it could also be a tiger, there is a chance, we don't know the odds, but there's a chance that it is a tiger and your lunch meat, right? And so we have been wired over time to think about the negative in order to protect ourselves. You think about the nervous system, and what we would say is it's pretty vigilant, When that performance review comes up, the reason that your nervous system and your brain latch on to the idea of getting a bad performance review, and maybe even being scolded by your boss or fired or whatever, is because it has picked up on those potential threats and it is trying to protect you from them. The challenge with anxiety in general, right, is it's actually a protective mechanism in general. The problem is that it gets dialed up so much that it becomes its own problem. It's sort of, what's the term? It's like the cure becomes worse than the disease itself, if you will, right? So going back to step 3 here, what I would say is, with all the steps, not every single one is going to land with every person in every context. But let's say, I'm going to a performance review. What I would be doing is I would sit down and I'd say, okay, I'm anxious. I have to admit that. I am scared about this thing, and my brain is making me think that the only possible outcome right now is me going in there and walking out of the room with my tail, tucked between my legs. Again, it's doing that because of the negativity bias and the fact that it wants to protect me. It wants to, make it such that I don't come up against those scary possible outcomes. The real challenge is the fact that if you think about it with a performance review or something similar, we don't have that much control over it, right? If the performance review is in a few days, like your performance was already given throughout the last year, right? And so, yes, we've got these protective mechanisms going, which in theory, they are great, they are well-intentioned, but like there's not much we can do in these last couple days before the review in order to ward off, some negative outcome. So what I would say, right, is like, it's sort of, you don't want to die twice in a way, which is to say, if you're going into that performance review and you are so nervous for many days leading up to it, you're dying once. And then if you go in and you actually get that negative review, you're dying again, right? Or you're suffering twice. Now, obviously, I'm not trying to dismiss anybody, like in the sense that if that's what your brain does and it's very hard for you to get out of that state, I will just put my hand up and say, I have been there before. I cast no shame upon you or anything like that. That's sometimes just how it goes. At the same time, if we look at this step and we say, why don't I try implementing it? Why don't I try to, get at the heart of what it's talking about? We would say, okay, I'm going into that performance review. Let me think about the different outcomes that are possible here. And seriously, like think about them all, right? Because, our brains tend to do the extreme thing too, where they're like, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to get fired. Or, if not that, maybe, who knows? Maybe it'll be great, right? And it's like you want to think about all the options between the polarities because they're all possible. So maybe I would say, hey, I could go in there, my boss could scold. Well, worst case scenario, I get fired on the spot, and that's that. That's not great, but that's what I've been thinking about. And no wonder I've been feeling so terrible. I'm focusing on something that I don't want whatsoever, and I can't really do anything about it right now. So why am I going to continue to think about it, right? If that's an option for me, if I can, focus on something else. Maybe I go in there and my boss says, hey, you're doing okay, but some of these areas need improvement. And if that happens, guess what? I'm not going to love it, but I'll come out of that meeting and I'll gather myself and I'll say, you know what? I have some things that I need to work on. I got actionable feedback that I can take into the next year and work on and figure out. And that's not the end of the world. Maybe he's like, you're meeting expectations and that's okay for now. That's good, right? That would be a good outcome. Maybe he's like, hey, you're actually doing pretty well. And that's really good. Or he says, you're doing so great. I want to give you a promotion, XYZ, whatever, And so again, it's just trying to expand your horizons, the horizons in your mind a little bit and say, when we get anxious, we are laser focused on usually one particular outcome or one particular category of outcome, right? All the ways that things could crash and burn. And so this step is just trying to say, hey, that loop is distracting you from the fact that other possibilities are indeed possible. And if you, kind of just think about them for a little bit, that might shift your focus and get you feeling a little bit better. It's not rocket science, but I know that like, just having been through this many times in my life, I come back to this one and I'm like, you know what? As a different example, if I'm going to a job interview, I got the same things running through my head. I'm going to get laughed out of the building, yada, yada, yada. And it feels, you get to this point of saying to yourself, like, why am I even going to this job interview? Like, I feel like I'm going off to war. Like I'm just going to open myself up to getting shot, and I mean that term loosely, metaphorically, whatever. But when you pull this step out and you think about it and you say, oh, that's right. I'm going to the job interview because I could actually get the job and my brain is distracting me from that outcome, making me forget about it. It makes me feel like I'm going through misery for nothing when in reality, I'm doing this for some particular purpose. And now that I see it again, hey, you know what? Maybe this isn't so bad after all. I have an opportunity here. I just need to remember that and refocus on it.
It's awesome. It's so great. I love that you gave permission to anyone listening to have that instant human response, the one that goes to the negative and maybe can't get out of it in that moment, but that you show that it is possible with paying some direct attention, with practicing, right? So you said that this has been a process for 10 years, and I'm sure that you've gotten better at noticing it and switching up the thoughts or going into the somatic movement or doing whatever it is to get you out of that fight or flight state to be able to think different thoughts. It takes practice, right? And that's what this whole podcast has been about, is just exposing people to different ways of thinking about this and also giving hope that episode 3 you may not have connected with that at all, but this one might be it for you because, like what you said before, there is something for everyone. We just have to keep looking for what it is, and whatever that modality or practice or whatever works for us. So I love that you said even in the 10 steps, one might work for you now, one might work for you when something else doesn't. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. You had alluded to the idea of being human and sort of like being kind to yourself, right? You really have to do that. And I think part of it is getting to a place where, again, you feel like you're not on the opposite side of the fence from your nervous system and from your brain and from your anxiety. Again, you're trying to harmonize everything that's going on inside of you. And so, I just think back to all the different times that I went through things like this. And I think about the idea of talking to yourself as if you were a good friend, right? You think about somebody who's going through something difficult. We are honestly and often very harsh to ourselves, right? If we mess up, if we forget something, we say, "Oh, you're so stupid. I can't believe you did that," whatever. How many times would you talk to a friend like that, right? If somebody messed up and you were friends with them, you'd say, "Hey man, like, it stinks. I don't exactly know what to say, but like, look, everybody has mistakes. We're gonna figure it out. We're gonna move past it. We're gonna put in, different practices to be able to not make the same mistakes in the future. I love you. I have your back. All that sort of stuff. We need to talk to ourselves like that because if you're on an island emotionally and you have nobody to talk to, if you don't have any outlets, the only person that could regulate you or help you overcome some of this stuff is going to be yourself. And if yourself is, the version of you that is criticizing and, holding yourself in contempt and talking down to yourself and whatnot, that's not a fun existence. So, I think that voice comes from a place of perfectionism, of wanting to always get it right, always do it right and whatnot. And it's funny because, well, funny, maybe ironic is the better word, but for like I remember early on in my journey, I was like, well, no, I can't do that because like, things could go wrong or whatever. And I would just have such a fear of failure. And we all do, we're all human. And I'm not trying to say that like it's easy to just get out there and fail, but it's funny because at the beginning of the journey, you are so afraid of failure that you don't even put yourself in the opportunities to fail because you're like, if I fail, I'm going to fall apart and I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm now 35. I've been in this journey for, basically half of my life. I still don't welcome failure, but I know that the place where if I'm at a place where I'm saying I can't fail, I'm too afraid to do that, whatever, it also means like I'm not willing to adjust my process. And it's almost I see that in myself sometimes, and I'm like, that's a very fragile place to be. Because if you're not, it sounds cheesy, but it's like if you're not failing, you're not learning. And if you're not learning, you're probably not rewiring your nervous system. If you're dealing with a lot of anxiety, if you're dealing with a lot of problems on the mental health front, your nervous system needs some level of rewiring. And you can only do that through experience, right? You could read a book. Yes, sure. You could read my book. That's great. But if you get out there and you have a real world experience, like in the performance review that we talked about, that's going to be immediate and real feedback that your nervous system is going to integrate. And you're going to say, oh, goodness, I learned that, hey, maybe I shouldn't do it this way in the future. I need to do it a different way. And so that failure becomes, another way of being able to talk to yourself in a nice light to say, hey, look, hey, we did fail, but guess what? We learned something. We're going to take it on the chin. We're going to try to change our approach moving forward. It's okay. We're going to move on, that kind of thing.
And building that helps, I think, build our trust in ourselves. That we can take some chances. It may not go the way we want it to go, but we can adjust, we can improve, we can do things differently, and we can learn something from it. And I wanted to say too that not only would we not talk to a friend the way we talk to ourselves, sometimes we wouldn't even talk to a stranger that way. We wouldn't even talk to an enemy that way. Sometimes it can be so rough. So I really appreciate you talking about paying attention to the way we're talking to ourselves and making the decision that we're not going to do that anymore, or we're going to at least practice giving ourselves some of that same compassion and understanding and forgiveness that we very generously give to other people.
For sure. And it's funny because we think we know how the failure is going to go. We say, "Oh, I'm going to fail. It's going to be the worst thing that's ever happened to me." A lot of the times the failure occurs or manifests in a way that we couldn't anticipate, and then something changes in our lives. Yeah, it's not always pleasant, but in the long run, it can be positive.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is so good. Is there anything else? Is there anything else that you'd like to leave our listeners with? I will be including all of the links to find you and connect with you and to your books and everything in the show notes. So people can definitely find out more by contacting you. Is there is there a first step or a go-to or one thing that you just feel like everyone should not should know, but that you would like everyone to know?
I kind of say the same thing at the end of most podcasts, and I would sort of echo it here, based on all that we've talked about. Right? It's a sort of a message of compassion, a message of hope, and a message of solidarity. In the sense that, like really, no BS. I've been through a lot of challenges on the mental health front. I know folks who are listening will have been as well. This stuff is hard. It is very, very hard. There's a reason, right, why, unfortunately, there are people who go through these things and aren't here anymore. This stuff is extremely difficult. At the same time, right, it can get better. It often does, but it takes time. So, developing that sense of self-compassion, developing that voice inside of saying, hey, things are going to be okay. We can talk to ourselves. The brain and the nervous system are not necessarily our enemies. Those are probably more fundamental and more important than anything else that you could learn on this journey. If you have those things, it's sort of, a faith in oneself that I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to figure it out. And my message to listeners would be, I think that you could figure it out. I think that you could get there. So, yeah, message of solidarity. I hope things get better for everyone who's listening. My heart goes out to folks who are struggling, and much love.
Thank you so much, Brian. Great job making time for yourself today. Be sure to subscribe to my Self-Care Shit, the podcast, wherever you listen in. Your 5-star review will help get this show to whoever needs to hear it. Go grab your free daily self-care checklist on myselfcareshit.com. Please take the last minute of this podcast for yourself to listen to the ocean waves and breathe.